Hello and welcome to Queen's University Belfast's latest Research to Reality Roundtable. Today we're exploring how Queen's academics are using emerging technologies in their work. Through the use of AI and VR, all our guests are seeking to improve people's lives. In this discussion we'll dive deep into their work, hear about the solutions they've developed and the impact they've made on people here in Northern Ireland and across the world. The academics I'm joined by today have backgrounds spanning the performing arts, film production, social work, psychology and computer science, with much of their research aligning with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 3, which covers good health and well-being, and Goal 10, which addresses reducing inequalities. I'm Mark Devenport, and joining me today are Professor Franziska Schroeder and Lucy Baxter, who are both from the School of Arts, English and Languages, Professor Paul Best from the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work, plus Professor Roger Woods from the School of Electronics, Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Starting with you, Lucy, can I just ask you to outline what research you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm a film practice lecturer here at Queen's, so I teach filmmaking. And I started here mid-career, so I had a career in film and TV before I started at Queen's. My research, my PhD research is looking at embodied virtual reality narrative dramas for use in health and social care and education.
Paul, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of mental health and I'm research director for the Centre for Technological Innovation, Mental Health and Education. My background's in social work and cognitive behavioural therapy, so I'm really interested in the use of technology within psychological therapies as well as for health and social care professional training.
Franziska?
So my title is Professor of Music and Cultures. I'm a musician, I'm a saxophone player by trade when I started back then. I'm interested in using technologies, working with disabled musicians as part of a group that I started here about 10 years ago called Performance Without Barriers. We co-design together with disabled musicians, musical instruments using virtual reality, AI and all kinds of digital devices.
And Roger, you've been here at Queen's for many years and you're working on all sorts of advanced computing.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of computer hardware and I'm particularly interested in using computing technology at the edge. In other words, trying to look at where we capture the information using sensors. So I build solutions that will work in low energy situations or where there's limited computation to be able to provide computational complexity to a different range of applications in the medical, manufacturing and infrastructure domains. So I'm particularly interested in looking to try and build new types of functionality, particularly bringing AI into the front end of sensors where you do processing, and that's looking and applying that in health applications, it's applying it in manufacturing, and it's applying it in structural monitoring as well of various structures.
Now, Franziska, Roger's talking about, if you like, the pure science that he works on the computing end, but he's also looking to apply it in various ways to health. I know in relation to your music that you've been using artificial intelligence and technology of all forms to try and help disabled musicians and other people who maybe face challenges in making music.
Yeah. I'll start with the AI bit, or maybe we can come back to the other later. But it's really interesting what you were saying, Roger, about AI and the whole sustainability piece, because, for example, I've trained my own algorithms on my own playing, so training an AI to be more embodied, to be more like a playing saxophone player. And of course, the whole issue around, you know, the sustainability piece of how much data we really need and, you know, what that does to the environment. It's a really interesting one. But more importantly, I've been working with disabled musicians and we are trying to harness the sort of power of AI, if you can say, to really make musical instruments much more bespoke. We know that, and Roger, I'm sure you have lots to say, how certain interfaces like a keyboard is not accessible to a lot of people with certain mobility issues. So AI is actually a really great tool where we can look at what a particular person needs to do, and then fitting the AI around it to make an instrument more accessible and more inclusive.
Can you give me an example of, say, a bespoke musical instrument that you've come up with which has enabled somebody to express themselves in a way they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
AI currently, because it is still so new, we're looking at, so for example, disabled musicians who may have really good upper body movements, but not necessarily being able to control what we call spasms. So maybe if one of their arms might move involuntarily, and the AI, by training an AI to really look at that person and to understand, well, maybe that movement wasn't necessarily intentional, meaning maybe that shouldn't be triggering a musical phrase. So the AI can really hone in on someone's, for example, facial recognition, on the eye movements, but can then maybe shadow out or delete involuntary movements, which is fantastic for a disabled musician who will feel so much more empowered by being able to use the body movements that they want to use.
And you've been able to have concerts and performances that have been performed using those kind of bespoke instruments?
Yeah, quite a lot. So last year or 2 years ago, we had a fantastic Belfast International Arts Festival, and it was probably the first time we managed to get several disabled musicians with their bespoke instruments, whether it was an iPad interface, a virtual reality instrument that had been created for and with them, with the Ulster Orchestra, which is the big orchestra here in Northern Ireland. And finally, after so many years, it was fantastic to see a professional orchestra playing alongside disabled musicians with very bespoke musical instruments.
Paul, Franziska's already made reference to VR, virtual reality, and now there's things like XR and AR, and I'll leave you to explain those acronyms to me. But you've got this background in social work and cognitive behavioral therapy, but you've been using these kind of technologies in order to apply that to specific cases. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing that for about 5 years now. Really, the idea being that we use within, I suppose, standard cognitive behavioral therapy, we rely a lot on images, particularly in conditions like social anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. They form a key part, I think, in the kind of sort of treatment pathway and the protocols we use.
And cognitive behavioral therapy involves talking to somebody who's maybe gone through some kind of trauma and trying to get to the roots of their problem.
Yeah, and it's really about understanding the meaning that that event had for them. So what we want to do in trauma therapy is really about going back into this really awful thing that's happened to them and open that up and find out about really what were they thinking at the time. And by building and constructing a kind of a virtual world around them, it can be a lot easier to do that, because as you can imagine, some people have been burying this memory for quite a long time. They don't want to go back there. They find it sometimes, although it sounds a bit counterintuitive, very difficult to access it. And then sometimes when they access it, it's very difficult to stay there. You know, the kind of tolerance of it, they want to kind of run away from it. And you might have some instances where, and Lucy might have seen it in her own work, where you kind of, the person will talk about some of these horrible things that will happen, but you notice the emotion doesn't change, and that's a sort of dissociative reaction. They're kind of just going through the emotions, but they're not emotionally connected to it. Virtual reality, I suppose, has been a really useful tool for us to kind of bring somebody back to the kind of scene of that traumatic event and to really kind of open up and identify those key kind of hotspots and appraisals that are really important, I suppose, because that dictates the next part of therapy where we try to challenge that or reappraise what happened.
I know in one of the projects that you were involved in that involved actually somebody who'd been assaulted in the centre of Belfast, and you were able to capture the scene, recreate the scene and take that person to the scene, but in a safe way.
Trauma environments have to be very bespoke to the individual. So there's a difference between having a Middle Eastern environment, which might service quite a number of soldiers, and somebody in the middle of Belfast, or somebody's got a hospital, birth trauma, or somebody who's been assaulted in a local restaurant. You have to recreate that same environment. And that costs quite a lot of money to do that, because it's only useful for one person in that sense. So we came up with this kind of unique workflow that allows us to speed up the production of those virtual environments. And it really is then about going to the scene of the trauma, taking images on your mobile phone, 2D images, and kind of making them 3D and sculpting them into a blank virtual reality canvas. So we retain some of the photorealism, so it doesn't all look like virtual characters and backgrounds, but you can walk and interact with the environment. We found that really powerful to bring people back into the trauma memory. What we're really doing is opening up that memory in a very structured, and as you say quite rightly, so safe and supportive way. The idea being that we kind of have to go back in and find out what really happened and what you suppose you thought during the trauma, and sometimes that can be kind of hidden or forgotten about. It's almost like when we're talking to clients, we say it's like, describe it as watching the worst parts of a horror film, all kind of sandwiched together and all cut together, where you forget about that part where the person fought back or ran away, and when you bring them back into the memory, that memory starts to open up and unlock. So it's a really interesting phenomenon that happens with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, where even though this memory's following them about, the full kind of expansion, it's quite fragmented, okay? So there's bits missing, and again, using virtual environments is really useful to kind of start filling in those blanks.
Now, Lucy, you have a background in documentary making and film making, but now in your current role, you've moved, if you like, from the flat screen to more immersive technologies. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so I have a background in kind of both drama and documentary, and when I moved from that career into academia, I started to do a PhD. So one of the things associated with a PhD is new knowledge. How can you do things differently, bring new knowledge into an area? So what I was most interested in was empathy. So can a narrative put you in someone's shoes, but let's put you in someone's body and in someone's mind? And if you're able to do that with the technology, does that then help with empathy for people, for example, who have to work with people who've experienced domestic violence, or does it help to understand complex topics like sexual consent, which is the most recent one that I've done? So the idea is kind of a visceral narrative. So I make quite high production value drama VR pieces.
In terms of your projects, are you using that with victims of domestic violence, or is it people who might be professional practitioners who are going to have to deal with them, or what?
Yeah, so far I've done quite a lot of viewings with the justice system. So with the probation board, the police, who are interested in empathy training for their staff. And also then I've done a research trial with social work students here at Queen's. And the idea there is to compare what they would normally get in the course of their training, which would be a written report about a domestic violence incident, versus the drama narrative, to see what the differences are in things like empathy and self-efficacy and knowledge and understanding of very nebulous sort of subjects like emotional abuse. So it's very much been justice and health and social care so far.
And since we are focusing on technology, particularly in this discussion, what kind of technology does that involve? Have people got VR headsets on? Is that how they go into this? Yeah.
Yeah, so I use a VR camera, stereoscopic camera, so it's like a 6-lens camera that you put into the environment, and that captures everything 360. So then whenever you've got that edited, you put that onto a headset. So people have to use the headset. One of the things that I do in my work is immersive sound as well, so you have positional binaural sound. So that's trying to replicate emotions within the body. So you might have feelings of panic or dread or shame, different parts of your body, in your chest, up around here, in your stomach. And also breathing and heartbeat. That's part of the kind of sound narrative as well. So you really have to be in a headset and immersed in it with headphones to be in that character, to be in that character's mind and body.
Roger, if I can bounce back to you. I mean, obviously a lot of what we've been hearing about clearly very beneficial for important areas of society, whether it's health or social work, all built to some extent though on having the current technological capacity that you have here at Queen's. A lot of that comes down to some pretty hefty hardware, doesn't it?
It does, and I think it's not just the hardware, but it's being able to effectively implement the requirements on that. So it's being able to translate the requirements of what whether it's the medical or the various therapeutic people need, to be able to translate that effectively and be able to put it in a cost-effective solution. Some of the projects we have ongoing, we've a project with the Tyndall Institute, which is based in Cork in Ireland, and it's to try and look at a camera at the end of fibre optic cables. So you're talking a fibre optic cable 1 millimetre squared, and the plan is that you would be able to have a technology that you would be able to insert the cable in without having to be intrusive in terms of the operation. There's a light source available, and you're able to do the processing. So as the surgeon is operating, the plan is that you would be able to do the detection to see if there's any anomaly or any feature that it has recognized from many operations before, to be able to guide the medical doctor to be able to identify where there's an issue. Another project we have with the Sano group in Krakow, which is into personalized medicine, is looking at bringing together a collection of AI algorithms with the idea of allowing the operator to be able to select what type of algorithms they want to use on medical data. So part of what we're doing there is looking at retinal scans and be able to detect any deficiencies or any diseases that are happening with retinal scans. And obviously, as you build up a body of that, you're able to go to the existing library of functions, be able to detect and indicate to the surgeon if there's things happening. So again, it's very much looking at what the requirement is and then being able to put in place the technology solutions for that.
One way in which a university interacts with wider society is through spin-off companies, and I know you've been involved with one, analytics engines. I mean, it's remarkable the range of projects that company's got involved in terms of everything from the dairy industry through to the National Gallery in London.
Indeed, and I think that the common theme is people are now, with technology capability, sensors are becoming very cheap. So we can start to put sensors into buildings, which people have termed a smart city. We can, obviously our mobile phone is a sensor, so there's a range of different sensors in your phone. So as you collect and collate the information, the question is, what can you do with it? And once you realize the quality of information, you can then really ask the questions. So one of the ones is from your own area with RTE, colleagues there, where they're looking from a media perspective and they're trying to do investigative journalism. So they want to detect if maybe someone who is involved in a government position has had other activities or other positions outside that may counteract or conflict with that. But it's very hard to collate all of the information. So being able to scrape wide range of data sources, look at the web and be able to collate information and present it clearly is advantageous there. The National Gallery, as you mentioned, they put on displays and they want to try and evaluate, has that display been successful? So how would you go about that? Well, you have wireless technology, so you can monitor people and the amount of people passing through in an area. It's not trying to detect individuals. So you can then say, well, if we've put a new exhibit on in a certain area, we can then monitor the traffic coming through and be able to know what's been successful. So knowing what they can put on in shows and what's attracting in terms of the footfall is really important to them. But again, it's that ability to define the requirement and then look at the viable solution to provide the solution for the need that you have.
Franziska, one thing that unites certainly the three of you here is this incredible mixture of backgrounds, if you like, whether it's film, social work, music, and what you've brought, I suppose, to your current work. In terms of the music, I know that you mentioned your work with disabled musicians, but I know that for quite some time you were working, for instance, on remote performances, even before the pandemic was a thing, and we were all thinking about communicating remotely.
That's right. So when the pandemic arrived, we were all already prepared in terms of how you can make music with people in different sites. I mean, VR is a really amazing an amazing artwork because it requires visuals, it requires writing drama, it requires the soft therapy, the sound and music, and I think that's why in the past our paths have crossed in that sort of medium. But in terms of remote performance, or what we call network performance, for many years, we started in about 2010, we had a really international collaboration with people from IRCAM, which is the Center for Computer Science in Paris, involving partners in Brazil, in Mexico, in Germany, in all over the place, and really looking at what happens if someone is playing, in New York in a cathedral, let's say saxophone player there, a saxophone player here in Northern Ireland in their bathroom, maybe a double bass player in Brazil. how, of course, because of latency, we've talked about this before.
Indeed, yeah. I was going to mention that latency is a big issue for your area.
What you said about journalists, you know, you pose a question to the journalist and she responds with a little delay. So those things, of course, we knew about, that there is a delay or latency in the network. I mean, speed of light, you need to have, you know, you have milliseconds of the sound or the music arriving a bit later. But it was interesting because from a sort of creative point of view, from a musician's point of view, what kind of repertoire suits itself to a medium, to the sort of technological medium that doesn't allow you to be synchronous. And so we actually had a really amazing study called the APART study in 2007, I think it was, where we had 3 musicians in Belfast in our sonic lab, putting them into 3 different rooms so they couldn't hear each other through the walls, but we introduced artificially that type of latency and then tested types of different repertoires. So Ornette Coleman, a jazz standard, which requires people to really synchronously play together, and of course it didn't work. So it was fantastic to see everyone was falling apart. The drummer thought he was playing in time. I thought I was playing in time. Everyone was accusing everybody else, saying, well, no, you were late. No, you were early. But it then was an interesting journey around, you know, what kind of scores in terms of how do you represent the music on paper if you can't play, let's say, bars and dots on paper. So we started experimenting with graphic scores, with 3D scores, things that would turn. So for example, Mark, if you sitting in London, you see one part of the score and I'm sitting in Belfast, I'm seeing a different part of the score. So lots of interesting things to tease out. So when COVID came, yes, people were hopping onto Zoom, trying to sing together. Didn't work so well, but we weren't surprised.
Of course, there would be some who will fear that technology might damage music, that we'll all end up with going and watching avatars performing. Is that a concern?
What's wrong with that? No, but I think seriously there are, of course, huge concerns around AI. We talked briefly about the sustainability piece. There's a lot of ethical decisions to be made in terms of the types of data that we're using, what AI tools, AI musical tools we're using, whose music has been trained maybe without consent into certain algorithms. But I think the way it can kind of shorten maybe the sort of gap between the ideas you might have and the outcome by using AI to really brainstorm and have thousands of ideas presented to you within 10 seconds. Lots of things you may have not thought about in terms of musical direction, composition, maybe texture, maybe instrumentation and so on. So it's an interesting time, I think. I have no issue with all of us playing AI sort of robotic music, but let's talk a little bit about where the human, I guess, is in this area of AI, which I think is an interesting thing. Not just where the human is, what the human is.
I suppose in relation to your area, Paul, it's important that the technology that you're working on is an adjunct to trained human professionals providing therapy, providing social work, whatever it is, rather than being seen as some kind of replacement, go off and talk to the computer.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what most of our work does. And I know that AI amongst clinicians pops up quite a lot because of this black box issue in terms of, you know, that's quite useful output we're getting, but I'm not quite 100% sure how it got to that, and then therefore can I trust it? And if I can't trust it, I certainly can't start using it with my sort of clients and patients. But yeah, a lot of the tools, I suppose digital technologies in general, and we have it's important to mention within the mental health space, a 10-year strategy. And Action 30 in that talks about, you know, digital options across all of the step care levels. And digital technology could be anything from just going online and looking up a website, get some more information, downloading an app, to maybe using an AI screener to kind of give you a bit more of an informed sense of what's going on before you even present to a primary care professional, your GP. At the kind of, and there's some work that we do in that space, but most of it is that kind of you're in therapy, and you know, the therapist wants to use this to really improve the work that we're doing, and that's where we see technology as being kind of really beneficial, but absolutely never to replace the professional, just to kind of support and enhance. In some instances, we've talked about trauma already, but we think about the pressures that we're having at the moment in terms of wait lists and services. I think there's over 17,000 people waiting. One of the ways we're trying to think about technology is about, can we shorten treatment tails for people? So by that, can you can you do the work you need to do in a shorter amount of time instead of 12 sessions? Imagine if it was done in 10, you get 2 sessions back. What would that mean in terms of speeding up the waiting list? So technology can be used in our trauma work. We're seeing some initial data. The final piece of the puzzle is normally to go to the site of the trauma that happened. So you give the example earlier about that person that was assaulted in Belfast. Well, in that person's mind, because the memory doesn't update, it still looks like it looked the night they got assaulted. You know, if there's a car accident, we've had people who have put 2 hours each way onto their journey avoiding a certain road because the body was still lying there. So you want to go back and show that things have changed, the body's not there, the place has been cleaned up. And by using virtual environments, actually we found we might not need to go to that site visit. And you don't just get a session back there, you get maybe half a day. You might have to travel to Enniskillen to do that. So that's one way in terms of technology actually helping the therapist, not just in terms of supporting a person in treatment, but also feeding back into the wider sort of systemic issues we're getting in mental health.
And you had, I mean, I don't want you to give away any medical secrets, but there was a reasonably positive outcome in that case that you were talking about.
Yeah, we're getting really good data, although again, as you say, it feeds into the point we are using a well evidence treatment protocol anyway, and the virtual reality is helping to enhance that. So they still get trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy with this additional VR component included.
Are there any other areas that you pick out where you or the Time Centre is using technology in your current research to try and address different challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it feeds into Lucy's work, I suppose, in terms of the training world. How do we, provide more, I suppose, nuanced training for our health and social care professionals before they go out. They're just with the pressures in the health system. I mean, there's some reports saying that CAM service, so child, adolescent mental health services, would need to double their staff complement just to meet current demands. But what happens is, particularly in social work, you'll then get students who are maybe, when they first qualify and would have traditionally been protected a bit in those first early years of their practice, are now getting more complex cases they're having to deal with. So as a university, need to try and respond to that. It's an interesting, I suppose, experience when you call to somebody's house for the first time. It can be quite visceral. You're also having to make decisions where you might be feeling a bit intimidated. There might be a dog in the kitchen and you're just worried that nobody opens the door and lets that dog out. There can be all sorts of smells and olfactory stuff happening. And what we can do is with virtual environments, we can help the person tune in and prepare themselves a bit better. It's not the same as real life, but just get a sense of, if we put you under a bit of pressure, if we make you feel intimidated, how might you react? How might that influence your decision making? And the AI piece then, which is really interesting, some of the work Roger's doing, that ability to have a conversation, very quick responses. We can give our the potential clients, the virtual avatar, some quite nuanced stuff. We've set up scenarios where it's been in a busy A&E department and we've said this person may or may not be suicidal. You've got 5 minutes to make a judgment, and they can go and have a fairly unstructured conversation. They're in charge of it, and they have to make a decision. We're either letting this person go home, or we're going to have to think about detaining them. You go in and make that kind of decision and determination. And that's not to be mean, but that's just because it's a safe environment, but it's just to kind of put our students under a bit of pressure, so then when it happens in real life, it's not going to happen all the time, they've got something to reflect back on. So that's another way that we can kind of try and improve services.
Yeah. Lucy, how have you found that students have reacted then to the use of VR and training?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just overlapping with what Paul's saying there. So there's a really broad range of responses that were interesting. Everyone agreed that the virtual reality environment gave them much more of an empathic view and helped them to understand nuances. As new social workers, they're coming into a domestic environment. They're having to gauge very subtle signs within that environment. They may not have experienced this kind of thing themselves, or they may have. That it covered both of those kinds of responses as well, that trial, which was quite interesting. So those students said that the virtual reality environment helped them hugely in terms of understanding the internal experience. So you might not see any of this, but you might be able to gauge from the interaction between two partners, for example, or from silence or from body language, what's actually happening that they may not have been able to do before having that direct experience within the headset. But they did also say that in terms of how training could be delivered for them, that the report that they receive is helpful for them contextually. So it helps them to have a bit of a factual framework for a scenario, but the immersion and the embodiment of the VR help them to understand what they might be dealing with much, much more deeply. So I think they wanted to have it delivered with both. One kind of complementing the other.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to have a discussion afterwards as to what they got out of it, and that's a human-to-human discussion, isn't it?
Yeah. So I did sort of quantitative and qualitative. So we did questionnaires and we did interviews. And we had all sorts of feedback as well that was quite interesting, just thinking about inclusivity and different ways of processing things, disabled musicians, for example, but also neurodiversity. So some people had fed back that because they weren't able to make mental pictures, that the visual was incredibly helpful for them to give them more of a handle on what they might be dealing with. So I think VR has so many different applications, but I think neurodiverse ways of processing the world are another way that you might want to kind of go in and do more research.
I mentioned previously to Roger about his spin-off company. I think you've got one too.
So my background kind of, I had a production company, so I sort of knew that landscape a little bit.
That was a TV production company previously. Yeah.
So I knew that landscape a bit, and so I was interested in seeing, could this be commercialized? So I have a spinning company called Sensalience, which has some investment from Cubis here at Queen's, so that's the commercialization part of Queen's. So they invested in Sensalience to see, well, could this be applied? Could this be applied to health and social care, justice sector, possibly corporate sector? So lots of different potential applications. So that's kind of happening in parallel to the research.
And how's that going?
And there was a recent report here, I think last year, about the gaps in sex and relationship education here. So I'm interested in looking at, well, how might we plug those gaps with training for teachers, for example, and we're also talking to the pupils as well. What would they like to get in terms of sex and relationship education, and why do the teachers feel that they can't deliver that, and what might they need in order to be more comfortable delivering it?
That maybe leads us naturally on to discuss challenges, because obviously that's an area where there's sometimes no consensus about what kind of relationship education a school wants to have inside, or different governors take different views. That's presumably one of just a number of challenges that you face in relation to your research.
Yeah, I think that's been really interesting here. So I think one of the challenges I've come across is partly gender-based. So it's harder to get boys and men to participate. That's partly with social work. I think it's quite heavily majority female students. Anyway, in the case of the trial that I did, it was. So there were only 2 men who took part. And equally then, when you're talking about things like sex and relationship education and consent, it's quite hard to get boys in on that. So that's something that I'm really trying to do with this current project. And then there's also the social and cultural kind of environment of here, where you have a lot of faith schools, you have a variety of schools, you have some that have an orthodoxy where they would not feel comfortable potentially delivering certain kinds of narratives. So we've been talking to them about, and schools have been engaging, but some have been pushing back and saying, we couldn't do that because it suggests sex before marriage, for example. So some very basic obstacles there in terms of the ethos of a school. So I think that's all really interesting and rich conversations to be had with schools to see how things might be adapted, and I'd love to see these films be used in schools.
Paul, how about in your own sphere? What kind of challenges would you say that you face?
Yeah, well, the big one at the moment is medical device regulations. so that's a current, and I'd be interested to see if Roger's had any experience with this. But that's a big barrier for us.
Tell me more about that.
Okay, so how long have we got? So it was interesting that what is a medical device, I suppose, is the first issue. So if we take virtual reality technology, which in some ways you could argue is just 2 TV screens put very close to your face, it actually has certainly our environments, they are replications of the environment in which a trauma might have took place, but they're not reenactments of it. Okay, so we don't reenact the assault, we're just back at that point in time. They mean nothing outside of the person who's maybe been assaulted there, and the therapist who knows how to use that environment in a therapeutic way. But its intended use is within therapy, and therefore comes under medical device regulations. And I think an example was given quite recently. If you had a Magnum, and you kind of ate the lolly, and you had that sort of stick that was left. So that's just a stick, obviously, to hold a Magnum. But if I got that stick and then used that to put down your tongue to see down your throat, Franziska, that's then a medical device. So we are coming up to a lot of kind of roadblocks because there's an additional process then in terms of notification to do clinical trials, and there's a cost implication to that. And actually a kind of an industry is built up around trying to get support with that approval. Now, it's absolutely there to make sure what's being developed is safe. And I should say that it's the software that's classified as a medical device, not the VR headset.
Because you're getting almost to a position where you'd have a TV being classified as a medical device, and you're showing somebody
I've asked that,
that's
yes,
therapeutic
or the webcam that's being delivered if you're doing an online therapy session. So we are going down. Now the problem is then that really disrupts innovation pathways, because a lot of the work we do is normally a collaborative effort between academics and sort of clinicians or service providers, and then industry as well. But sometimes you have an idea, you talk it over, or maybe the clinicians come with an idea, and you want to just dip your toe, just have a test to see whether it works or not. You don't have maybe the money required to get medical device approval for something that you may not actually end up running with, or you may not actually be developing for any sort of profit. So that's a really, really big
Has that been a challenge for you, Roger, or not?
Oh, definitely. I think, because the other aspect I'd say is, trying to get technologies through. I think one of the issues is you're probably really depending on large medical companies who are going to have the budgets and pockets to be able to spend the time going through the medical side of things, being able to get through. So to some extent, a lot of the stuff we've done has been with commercial partners who are going to be taking that on board. And I think you have to be realistic that if you're building a particular technology on your own, it's going to be a long journey, and it's going to take a lot of money and investment. So I think that's something that we probably have avoided to some extent.
Franziska, I'm assuming you don't have to get your musical instruments licensed, but I suppose resourcing is a challenge for everyone.
But yeah, a lot of things chime with my work as well. I mean, for example, the last project we worked with people with dementia, recreating kind of musical environments from, their past, from their 20s and 30s, and so building a VR environment. And there the challenge, of course, with people's health just deteriorating, and people with dementia just don't get better, they just get worse. And so once you have a sort of a bespoke environment that you've built, it might be meaningless, let's say, in 6 months' time, because their health has sort of deteriorated. So I think the bespoke nature of a lot of things, so for example, when we build instruments in VR with disabled musicians, it is bespoke for that particular ability of that particular musician. So I have one set in a room with a spin out or spinner in company, and the message I got is like, it's just too bespoke.
The other thing is, which I'm sure you've come across, and this is kind of across industry and academia, and the two trying to work together, is adoption of headsets, for example, so technology adoption and technology evolution. So that's one of the things that also with funding applications, things change so it's incremental with these kind of funding things, and things can change very rapidly with technology.
By the time you get some funding, you find that what you were
have
planning
to use different
do
kits,
is out of date.
And also just the adoption. So there's very few. So the Met Police in London, for example, have rolled out headsets across the whole of the organisation, but there's very few public sector organisations who have done that. So you have patches. You have pilots, and we go out with headsets, we give people headsets, we send people headsets. You can do it either remotely or in person, but there isn't mass adoption of that tech, that hardware, so that's quite a challenge as well.
Obviously, Roger, you're working to use technology to improve people's lives, but Are you concerned that it could be used for precisely the opposite, namely that there's a big ethical risk with a lot of the technology that we're seeing coming along these days?
Absolutely, and I think there's probably two areas I would concentrate on. Paul mentioned it earlier in the discussion where he talked about the black box aspects of AI. People don't know the algorithms, they don't know the data that's been used to train them. So I think there's really now an emphasis on explainable AI, particularly in the medical domain, where people want to know what data was used to train the algorithms and what type of algorithms are being used and are they understood. So in other words, there's code available for the algorithms, there's data sets so that people can repeat things in terms of experiment and training of those aspects. So the university now has just started a major, between the medical faculty and the engineering faculty, a major project looking at trying to have explainable AI in the medical domain across a range of topics. And I think the other aspect that's close to my own heart is security. We're starting to see sensors develop now that are only $1 or $2. You have good security on your phone, or at least you have the capability of it if you keep it up to date. But if you're doing a $1, $2 sensor, how do you go about doing security on that? And if they're being used in a medical domain, that's a particular problem because obviously privacy is a big issue for patients. Therefore, the ability for me to be able to see your information or illegally look at your information is a big issue. So I think there's two things there. We want to ensure confidence of how we ensure the integrity of data and store it.
Franziska, how do you go about addressing this? Because there is obviously a lot of skepticism out there as to where this is all going to end.
There is, and interesting you say that because I teach AI and music in the first year when students come in, and I find it really surprising how they're quite reluctant to engage and to use it. So I try and convince them to think of it more as a sort of co-creation, work with the AI, and we'll work out lots of ideas of how you might use it to better practice or to more efficiently practice. But in terms of the ethical things around the work I do with the disabled musicians, there's obviously always has to be consent, going back to what Lucy was saying. And that's why I started training my own algorithms. I know what's going in and I know what's in the AI. And interestingly enough, a couple of artists, Holly Herndon being one of them, already quite a few years ago, she developed a platform called Spawning AI where artists could see if their artwork, whether it was visual or music, if that had been used to train an AI algorithm without consent. And I've recently noticed when a technique called style transfer, so if you, for example, go to ChatGPT and say, can you, give me a poem that's a bit in the style of Seamus Heaney, for example. It's become much tighter around it that a lot of AI platforms will now say, well, I can't give you a poem like Seamus Heaney, but I can give you something in the flavor of an Irish something. So there's definitely a huge issue around algorithms having been trained in the past. I think it's changing slightly without consent. But in terms of the disabled musicians, I think starting again from the bottom, starting with consent and then training ideally very individual AI algorithms, I think that's a really good way to go.
Paul, in your sphere, what are the ethical risks you can see?
Yeah, well, I think, I suppose my biggest worry really in terms of AI, and I think when I first started looking into sort of technology for my doctorate kind of a while ago now, I was really focused on social media. And back then it was really about, look, if technology is useful or neutral, then it really is just about how we use it. And I think I kind of view AI in that same way. Where I worry is, and we might see it a bit with the students' use of AI, particularly if you're a health and social care professional, is it being used as a shortcut, and a shortcut to learning. Yes, I can see potential for it to maybe speed up some of the more bureaucratic elements of it. Maybe it might lead to more face-to-face time with our service users and clients, which can only be a good thing. But if you use it to take shortcuts in terms of how you assess people, how you, maybe write assignments that are talking about your understanding of the therapeutic process, then do we end up with a workforce that perhaps relies on AI to do some of the core functions of the role. And that's what kind of worries me a bit. and how do we as sort of educators make our students aware on some level that that's not appropriate, but also how do we set up our courses and our assessments to make sure that that can't happen. So that's one of my kind of concerns in terms of AI at the moment.
And Lucy, are there dangers in relation to technology and AI that keep you up at night?
Less so with the AI aspect, because I haven't hugely brought that in. I've brought it a little bit into my teaching, but not so much in my practice. But when I was developing ethics applications, which I had to do for my practice projects, for my VR projects, the main thing that people brought up as a concern was triggering. So being triggered, that's something that Paul referred to earlier, and I think it's interesting what you said about people who are already traumatized, and so what is that idea of being re-triggered or triggered? And I think I have shown that first emotional abuse piece to quite a large number of people, and 2 out of that large cohort did experience what they described as really intense responses, both of whom had had a very recent experience of emotional abuse themselves in their personal relationships. And so I spoke to one of those people about how might we mitigate that. If I had put a screener clip at the beginning of that film to orientate you in the world, might that have helped? And she said, well, yes, but I probably wouldn't have done it. And I also find it incredibly useful when I did do it, although I also find it triggering. So I think that's an interesting question around education. How much, if you're being very cautious about triggering, are people losing out on that learning, on that very deep learning that they need to have within social work, for example? So that's something that, Paul was overseeing the trial that I did, and that's something that we discussed. So I think that's an interesting question about that technology. The other thing then with being triggered emotionally is if you're working with, if and when I'm working with teachers who might have personal issues or personal reasons why they don't feel comfortable delivering relationship and sex education, how might you deal with that coming out and that kind of trauma coming out? So that's something that I'll have to think about if I go on to work with them, in terms of having somewhere for them to go or for them to talk to either before or after that experience, that in case it brings something out. So I think emotional triggering is an interesting aspect of it.
And Mark, if I may, just as a university, and I think educators in general, I think we're all facing the same issues and challenges around AI now. Of course, students using it to write essays and so on, but I think for all of us to rethink of our assessment methods, of course, maybe I think a lot of us will be moving away from just writing essays. So to really engage students to use AI in much more critical ways, how do we engage them? Critical thinking skills, what are the sort of human skills or more than human skills, and all of these things. I think we're just sort of we're in the middle of it, because of course semester is starting, we're all having to rethink of how we assess our students.
Might the irony be, Roger, that you can use AI in the research, but when it comes to exams you might have to go back to pen and paper?
Yeah, well a lot of what we try to do in engineering, to our mind, you'll set the problem to see how the student thinks about the solution. And I think the more that you can do that, whether that's through a practical session or through an exam question, that's really what you want to isolate, because at the end of the day, I can search the web if it's a piece of coursework that you ask me to submit next week. If I'm clever, I'll go out and find the information for doing it. But if you're putting me in the spot, asking me to analyse things, it's me in the room without the connection of the technology. So I think there's ways of doing it at particular times. Some assessments will work in some environments.
Roger, we've been talking about using technology to improve people's lives. Now that's something that you have very personal experience of.
Yeah, just really to mention to the audience, unfortunately I had a major injury 10 years ago, an incomplete spinal injury, which left me with limited mobility. Initially it was very severe, and I wasn't able to use my hands, so the ability to use speech recognition was important. Now, 10 years ago, speech recognition was good, but not perfect, so I did struggle to use it, and I had to speak very clearly and slowly to pick it up. But now the technology has advanced to such a level that I would use it for all of my documentation creation, all my emails, etc., with some modifications to obviously make corrections. But obviously looking at mechanisms that are able to help me. My car has light and steering facilities for me to be able to drive. So again, the ability to use technology to make people independent. Until you lose your independence, you don't really appreciate the need to be able to get it back. So all of the technology offering the capability for me to get back somewhere to where it was before the accident is absolutely vital.
Has that perhaps given you, if you like, an extra sort of sense of looking to where technology can actually be used to improve other people's lives, that fact that you've seen how it's closed up the gaps for yourself, as it were?
Absolutely, and not that I wouldn't have been appreciative before, but it certainly gave me an impetus to try and look at how we use it. The project I mentioned with Tyndall, where we're trying to put advanced technology onto this in vivo camera system, you know, the thought that that might be able to be taken through by medical companies to be able to be used for operations to try and improve people's time, because it means then when people operate, they can have an examination without major surgery, where you are able to do pinhole technology and be able to go in and examine parts of the body that you probably only would have been able to do before with major surgery. So obviously that gives you major advantages there. A lot of what we're doing on the AI tools for medical applications, again, you're hoping that that will assist. So you're not trying to replace the medical doctors, you're trying to assist them and provide capability for them.
And Franziska, in your own field, obviously we've talked already about working with musicians with a disability. I mean, this is something which you must get enormous feedback from them afterwards if you've successfully managed to address their problems.
It is so important, and it really rings true what Roger was saying, that, you know, it's absolutely, it's the musician's instrument, so they have to make the decisions of what they want to play, how they want to play it. And it's been such an interesting journey to see what an instrument, a musical instrument, can be or what it cannot be, and you know, really blowing our minds, working with disabled musicians of redesigning and co-designing with us. So yes, we've had...
It's very much a cooperative exercise,
yeah,
is what you're saying.
Exactly. It's
and sometimes does it exceed what you think might be possible?
Well, and what I think doesn't actually matter at all, because I might come with preconceived ideas and saying, well, great, let's make you a really nice flute, and it becomes really inaccessible because they can't, you know, press a button down, or if we're doing something in VR, you know, the headset might just be too heavy. Or I have worked a lot with blind musicians. A headset makes no sense to put on someone who has no vision anyway. So, you know, how can you harness, and it goes back to what you're saying, how can you harness the technology of VR in a meaningful way for someone who doesn't see, but there's other things that you can do with it. For example, you know, it doesn't have to be visual. Maybe you use the positional audio, what you were saying before, but using audio that comes from all around you, 360 audio, which is really meaningful for a blind musician. You know, the way they can listen to a space, and the way they can think of their instrument more of a non-visual tool, for example.
Paul, does this chime with you? Yes?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, very interesting in hearing what Franziska was saying, and then Roger sharing his story. After the sort of pandemic, we were getting quite a lot of cases coming through of ICU-based trauma, which is an interesting kind of formula. It's roughly maybe about 60% of people might present with sort of post-traumatic stress disorder following sort of ICU submissions. What makes it kind of, I suppose, the added complexity around it is this delirium that people experience when they're ICU. I think again it might be as much as 80% of people, just given, you know, the traumatic experience they've been through physically. If you're in ICU, you're not in a great state. A lot of drugs. You're kind of, maybe you're not fully unconscious, but you're not fully awake. So you're sort of half getting information in, and your body's maybe, or your mind's maybe, you know, filling in the blanks. So we have people coming through thinking they might have been, you know, being tortured because of some of the procedures.
Sounds very familiar.
Yeah, and some people who maybe they've got tubes in and they can sense that, but maybe they're pulling the tubes out, so they've got mitts and kind of strapped down. You might be hearing different languages in the background. And in COVID, a lot of people were wearing, you know, like space suits and might have thought they're being abducted by aliens. Some people have dreams where they're talking to dead relatives and they interpret that as crossing over. And we started using technology similar to, because you just mentioned 360 video, and I know Lucy uses that, where we were able to try and, I suppose it's different in a way if you wanted to recreate a trauma environment. You're asking someone to potentially relive a delirious episode, so the realization that actually this doesn't mean anything, you're talking to a deceased relative, didn't mean you were crossing over. But we were using technology, and you said about sounds, and the sounds of the machines and the chattering in the background. I would have had people within therapy sessions sitting with their feet up with the headset on, looking at the very distinctive kind of squares on the ceiling that we see in hospitals, and having those sounds of the machines going as a way of treatment. So again, not using full VR but 360 video, so it just kind of stood out to see the sort of what you seen was the kind of benefits in terms of your physical health recovery of technology, but also how technology was being used to help with some of the psychological recovery.
And part of the thing, we did a model, as you well know, where we did a real-time model and used computer hardware to do it. And the fascinating bit to me was to see, well, you've created the model, what we need to do is sit with the composers and evolve the interface. And that was the bit that, as a technician, you didn't have the appreciation of, that you actually had to evolve the instrument and work out, you know, and when you look at a guitar, how is a guitar shaped the way a guitar is? And that's through an evolution of people interacting with it.
How is that co-design, just out of interest, you're talking about co-design, is that remotely you're doing that, or is there ever an in-person?
It's always in person.
It's always in person.
So we work with a charity called Drake Music, Northern Ireland, that supports musicians, disabled musicians, to compose, to perform independently. And I'm doing this because, of course, independency is a wide term. And you know, if you're in a wheelchair, there's always going to be carers helping you with certain things in your lives. But we always have the musicians, and we start from scratch a bit more. What's the sort of music you want to make, how you want to make it, and we design things around them. So successfully, many years ago, we designed an instrument around a girl with cerebral palsy who wanted to move her arms. She actually said she dances, so she moves her legs less successfully, but a lot of arm movements. And the fact that you can, with this sort of movement, you can make great music, right? So you can trigger things, and we built her a beautiful, colorful interface that had nothing to do with the piano. It didn't look like a saxophone or anything, but it made music, and it became her instrument that was sculpted around her chair and around her sort of environment, and was beautiful. It was also beautiful to see because, of course, with VR, you can project to the audience what you're seeing inside the headsets. So always with people.
Lucy, just as Roger's personal experience has informed his work with technology, it's been a matter of personal experience that's informed your work as well.
Yeah, so I've kind of, as a methodology, when I was sort of working within my PhD, and I was thinking about methodology, which is, you know, part of what you have to develop within your writing. And I realized that a lot of the things I was making were based on personal experience or elements of personal experience, but often mixing that with kind of workshopping and talking to people about their experiences as well. So a bit of co-devising and a bit of scripting from my own personal experience. So that's a kind of autoethnographic research method where you're bringing your own experience, and that was very much what I did when I was scripting, writing my pieces. Yeah.
Which brings a degree of veracity to it, I suppose. Yeah. Just to conclude, I mean, can you tell me sort of what you're working on now and what you're hoping to move on to in the future?
Yeah, so I have just completed my most recent films, which it's a series of 2 films called The Afters. Jenna's point of view and Charlie's point of view, and that's in 2 different characters in a sexual interaction.
In relation to consent?
In relation to sexual consent. So you're inside different points of view. It's not all embodied. Sometimes it's embodied. Sometimes it's very close in the headset, and sometimes it's third person. So it's slightly different, a sort of evolution of the practice from the last one that I did, which was all embodied. And that's aimed at kind of 16 to 20-year-olds. Well, ideally even younger, actually 14 potentially. To be used within schools. And then the next evolution, I hope, of that will be developing training tools for teachers. So I'm looking at a research application, looking at that, if we can do VR pieces around relationship and sex education training.
Paul?
Yeah, so I suppose my bit of work I'm focusing on at the moment is that I'm co-chairing the group that is writing and developing the digital mental health action plan for Northern Ireland. So that's essentially a mental health forum has been put together by the Department of Digital Mental Health Experts to really try and achieve Action 30, which is the sort of digital options across all the step care levels. So the idea being that we never want digital to be a kind of an either or as a way to maybe circumvent, sort of waiting lists and kind of face-to-face services. We don't want people thinking they're forced into digital options, but just to provide them, to give people more kind of, I suppose, access and potential opportunity. So that's going to be a kind of a big focus of my work over the next few months in terms of writing that. And then hopefully, as we see that work kind of evolve and develop, we then will start to see for everyone here, when you want to go and seek some mental health support and guidance, that you get a lot of digital options as well as the sort of face-to-face.
Franziska, how about yourself in terms of the future?
The future for me, I think I've started thinking much more about embodied AI, so how we make AI more physical. As I said at the beginning, I started 3 years ago training my own style of saxophone playing into an algorithm, so ideally I can play with an AI that makes music with me as if it was another human being. But recently I started with a collaboration with Professor Tao Tanaka in Goldsmith, who has been using EMG sensors, so muscle sensors, and a colleague of mine, Federica Rubin in York University, and I've just come back from a mini residency where I've basically strapped myself into sensors. So when you play the saxophone, there's so much going on, of course, fingers are moving, but also, your chest is expanding and your heart is, ideally your heart is working. But also, skin, you can measure skin, sweat, and so on. So we're starting to train all that data into an algorithm to see maybe what you said before, Mark, about, robot music. I'm not trying necessarily to create an AI robot, but I think that's, and maybe you can pick up on this, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of how AI can be more embodied and can be more physical.
Roger, what does the future lead
Well,
bring for you?
one of the issues of working in technology is your children never know what you do. Until COVID, we went to order a new car and we're told we couldn't get it for a year because of lack of semiconductors. And they went, that's what you do, isn't it? And suddenly now people realized the lack of semiconductors is now a major issue. So part of what I've been doing is through the eFutures network, which we lead here at Queen's University for the UK, is looking how we bring together all the expertise across the UK with regard to semiconductors, because it's a major supply chain issue. 62% of the semiconductors are made in Taiwan, and we know there's a particular situation in Taiwan in regard to China. So again, trying to look at how we strategically bring a lot of this together is going to take a lot of effort over the next few years. So we've put together a strategy for the universities, which we've just published, and we'll be looking to implement that in the next few years.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of our guests for joining me. It's been fantastic to hear about their work and the difference they've been making in the world. This has been the Queen's University Belfast Research to Reality Roundtable. Thanks to all of you for joining us.